90 years ago, a hollow in the Great Smoky Mountains went quiet, and everyone who knew its name agreed to forget it. There were no headlines, there was no funeral, there was only a road that stopped meaning anything, a bridge that rotted where it stood, and a name that people in 3 counties learned not to say out loud. Blood Fork. Last winter, a logging crew cutting a new access line above the Little Pigeon watershed pushed their machine through a stand of black birch that had no business growing where it grew, and the ground gave way beneath the treads. Under 90 years of leaf fall and washed clay, the blade caught the corner of a stone wall, then a second wall, then a doorway low and square and cut with a care that no cabin in these mountains was ever cut with. The crew climbed down into a hollow that appears on no map printed after the 1920s, and what waited for them there did not match anything anyone had ever been told about how these mountains were settled. It matched something older, something the peoples who lived along the ridgelines spent 3 whole generations trying to bury. This is the story of the Marrick clan of Blood Fork, the family the record forgot on purpose, and after 90 years it is finally coming back up out of the ground. Before we go any deeper, do one thing for me. Type the words Blood Fork in the comments below. That single word tells me you can sit with the whole truth, however dark it gets, and it tells this platform to carry the story to the people who are meant to hear it. Type it now, then stay close, because from here the ground only gets softer. To understand what the logging crew walked into, you have to understand the shape of the land itself, because in these mountains the land keeps its own kind of ledger. The Smokies are not gentle country. They fold in on themselves. A ridge that looks like a single wall from the valley floor turns out to hide a dozen hollows behind it, each one a narrow green throat of laurel and hemlock where the sun reaches the creek for maybe 3 hours a day and never touches the north bank at all. People settled these hollows one family at a time, and once a family took a hollow, that hollow took the family name. There was Cade's Cove, and there was Greenbrier, and there was Cataloochee, and the names went down onto the county maps and into the church rolls and into the memory of everyone who traded at the crossroads store. Blood Fork was different. Blood Fork was a hollow that the other hollows did not talk about, and a place that the mapmakers, when they came through with their chains and their transit levels, seemed to walk right past without ever writing it down. The old people who would speak of it at all described it the same way. You went up the middle prong until the water split, and you did not take the left fork because the left fork was the Marrick fork, and the water that came down it ran a strange rust colour for the first mile, as if something upstream were bleeding slow into the creek. That is where the name came from, or so most people believed. Blood Fork, the colour in the water. But there were older folks, the ones born before the turn of the century, who would lower their voices and tell you the colour came second and the name came first, and that the name was already old when the first white settler ever set eyes on that water. They said the Cherokee who hunted these ridges for 1,000 years before anyone else arrived would drive game right up to the mouth of that left fork and then turn back every time and let the deer go rather than follow it into the trees. Whatever was up there, they had a word for it, and the word was not a welcome. For a long stretch of these mountains' history, that is all Blood Fork was. A place you did not go, a fork you did not take, a rust colour in the water, and a coldness in the story. And that would be the end of it, a mountain superstition like 100 others, except for one detail that turns the whole thing from a ghost story into something far worse. Because when researchers went looking for Blood Fork in the actual paper record, in the surveys and the census sheets and the tax rolls that are supposed to account for every acre and every soul in these counties, they did not find a thin record. They did not find a poor record. They found no record at all. Blood Fork is not underdocumented. Blood Fork is erased. Think about what that means for a moment. Every hollow in these mountains was surveyed. Every family was counted, taxed, married, buried, and written down somewhere, because that is what a government does. It keeps a ledger of the living and the dead. The census taker walked every road in these counties and knocked on every door decade after decade and wrote down the name of every man, woman and child he found. And yet, when you pull the survey plats for that watershed, the ones drawn up in the 1830s and 1840s, you find something that should not be possible. You find a blank, not a note that says nothing is here, not a mark for uninhabited land. You find the survey lines running right up to the edge of that hollow from every direction, and then you find the interior left empty, the way a mapmaker leaves a lake empty, except there is no lake there. There is a settlement, there are stone walls 100 years old, There are the foundations of a mill, and on the paper that is supposed to hold the truth of this country, all of it has been left as clean and white as fresh snow. There is a story that goes with those blank survey plats, and it is worth telling because it is the first crack of light on the whole thing. A surveyor, named on the county payroll, worked that watershed for 2 full seasons in the 1840s, running his lines, driving his stakes, filling his field books page after page with the careful numbers of his trade. His books survive. You can read them. And there is a run of days in the late autumn of one of those years where the entries simply stop, not because he quit. The pay records show he kept drawing his wages. The entries stop for 11 days, and when they start again, the handwriting has changed, gone small and cramped, and pressed so hard into the paper that in places the pen tore through. The lines he drew after those 11 days do not close. A survey is supposed to close the way a fence closes around a field, the last line meeting the first. His lines around that hollow run out into the margin and end in nothing, as if the man could not make himself finish the shape. On the last usable page, below the final broken line, he wrote 4 words that no county surveyor has any business writing in an official book. He wrote, "They asked me not to." Then the field book is blank to the end. Nobody knows who they were, nobody knows what they asked, but from that autumn forward, Blood Fork stops appearing in the paper record of these mountains, and it stays gone for the better part of a century. The taxman does not tax it, the census man does not count it, the road commission does not maintain the trace that leads to it, and within a generation that trace has grown over so completely that a man could stand 50 feet from the mouth of the left fork and never know a road had ever been there. An entire settlement, walled in stone, milling its own grain, burying its own dead, and it slips out of the official memory of the country as smoothly as a stone slips under still water. That is not how erasure normally works. Erasure is usually violent and loud. This was quiet. This was agreed to, and the only reasonable way to read it is that someone somewhere decided that Blood Fork was better left off the ledger of the living, and that everyone who knew why went along. And it did not stop with one generation of paper. That is the detail that turns a strange omission into something deliberate and sustained. The blank did not merely appear once and get copied forward by lazy clerks. It was maintained. Each new survey that came through in the decades after, each fresh census, each updated tax map drawn to replace the last, arrived at the hollow, ran its lines to the edge, and left the same hole in the same place, as if every mapmaker who ever worked that watershed received the same wordless instruction the first one did, and obeyed it the same way. A mistake gets corrected. A gap gets filled the next time somebody checks. This gap was never filled. For the better part of 100 years, through changes of government and changes of method and changes of every single hand that held the pen, the interior of Blood Fork stayed white, and the only way a thing stays white that long on paper, that careful, is that keeping it white was the job. Somebody was always making sure, and whoever they were still making sure long after Elias Marrick and every soul who first agreed to the silence had gone into the ground. Before we move on to the arrival of the first Marrick, stop for a second. What you just heard about a whole settlement scrubbed from every map and every county record is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original survey pages. The blank interior squares, the empty county ledger. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The man who took Blood Fork was named Elias Marrick, and almost everything anyone can say about where he came from turns to smoke the moment you try to hold it. The stories agree that he arrived in these mountains sometime in the 1820s on foot alone, an older man already when he came, which is strange in itself because men did not usually strike out to break new ground in the wilderness after their prime. Young families came to the frontier. Elias Marrick came like a man who had already lived one whole life somewhere else and had reasons to leave it behind him. He did not come up through the settled valleys the way newcomers did, stopping at the crossroads store, asking after land, letting the community look him over. He came down out of the high country from the north, from the direction of the bald ridges where nobody lived, as if he had walked over the top of the mountains rather than around them, and the first anyone below knew of him was smoke rising out of the one hollow no one wanted. What little description survives of him is the kind that sticks in a person and does not leave. They said he was tall in a way that seemed wrong for how he moved, that he stooped through doorways but crossed open ground faster than a tall man should. They said his hands were too long. They said he spoke rarely, and when he did his voice was low and even and carried further than it had any right to, so that a man standing across a field would hear Elias Marrick as if he stood at his shoulder. And they said his eyes did not sit right in the light, that in shadow they looked ordinary and dark, but catch them at the wrong angle in the sun, and there was a paleness far back in them, a shine like the shine of standing water in a cave. The people who traded with him in those first years, before the hollow closed itself off entirely, said you did not want to be the last one talking to Elias Marrick when the light was going. He came with money, which was its own mystery. A man walking alone out of the wilderness should have had nothing, but Elias Marrick paid for what he needed in old coin, heavy silver of a kind the storekeepers did not recognize and weighed rather than counted, foreign markings worn smooth on faces too old to name. He bought tools, he bought seed and stock and iron and glass, more glass than any cabin needs. Pain after pain of it hauled up the trace on the backs of hired men, who would not go past the mouth of the fork and set their loads down there and would not carry them a step further no matter the pay. And he bought quiet. It was understood, in the way these things get understood in a small place, that the Marrick fork was Elias Marrick's business and no one else's, and that a man who went up there uninvited did not always come back down, and that the ones who did come back down came changed and would not say why. For the first years there was only him. Then there was a woman, though no one in the valley ever saw her arrive, and no one could say afterward whether she had come up the fork or been born out of it. Then there were children, and here the ordinary shape of a frontier family bends and goes wrong, because the children of Bloodfork did not marry out. In every other hollow in these mountains, families braided together over the generations, a Cade girl marrying an Ogle boy, a Whaley marrying a prophet, the bloodlines crossing and recrossing, until half the county was cousins in one degree or another. That crossing is what kept the hollows human. It is how a small isolated people stays healthy enough to go on. The Marricks did not do it. The Marricks turned inward from the first generation and stayed turned inward. And whatever Elias Marrick was, whatever it was he carried down out of the high country in his two long hands and his cave water eyes, he bred it back into his own line on purpose, and he kept it there, and he did not let it out. The thing that the logging crew found under the clay, and the thing that survey plats and ghost stories never prepared anyone for, was the building itself, because Bloodfork was not a cluster of log cabins. Log cabins is what these mountains were made of, notched timber chinked with mud, a chimney of creek stone, a roof of split shakes, the honest crude work of people who had a summer to get under cover before the snow came. What the Marricks built in that hollow was something else entirely, and it is the single hardest fact in this whole account to sit with. They built in stone, cut stone, dressed and fitted stone, the blocks squared true and laid so tight that 90 years in the ground did not open the seams, laid without mortar in the oldest walls, because the fit alone held them, the way the great old walls in far older countries were laid by people we no longer have names for. In the 1820s, in a hollow that could barely be reached on foot, with no road for a wagon and no quarry anyone can find within miles, a lone old man and his inbred children raised walls that a modern mason would look at and quietly admit he could not match. The crew measured the main structure before they understood what they were standing in. Low and long, dug half into the north bank so that the cold side of the building was the living rock of the mountain itself, the front face rising in courses of that impossible stonework to a height a man could not reach. The doorways were the detail that broke people, square-headed, cut with a hard, clean lintel, and low, always low, so that even the children of the valley who came up later to look would have to bow their heads to pass through, as if the doors were built to make every living thing that entered them stoop, to make you lower your head before you came inside. And the glass. All that glass Elias Marrick hauled up the fork went into deep, narrow windows set high in the walls, too high to see out of, too high to see in, letting a grey light down into rooms that the sun never reached directly, so that the inside of the Marrick house was always the colour of the hour just before a storm. Below the house was the mill, and the mill is where the strangeness of the place stops being architecture and starts being intent. A grist mill in these mountains is a simple, honest machine. A wheel, a race to turn it, a shaft, a pair of stones, and grain going in one end as flour to come out the other. The Marrick mill had a wheel and a race and a shaft, and it had stones, but the stones were wrong. They were too large, far too large, to grind the little grain a family could raise in a shaded hollow, and they were cut from a dark stone that is not found in that watershed, that is not found anywhere near it, a stone that came from somewhere else the way the silver coin came from somewhere else, and the race that fed the wheel did not run only with creek water. There was a second channel cut deeper, lined in that same fitted stone, running back up into the dark under the north bank, where the cruise lights would not reach the end of it, and the rust colour that gave Blood Fork its name did not come down the natural creek at all. It came down out of that second channel, out of the dark under the mountain, and it came down strongest in the deep of winter, when the natural creek ran clear and low, which is exactly backward from how a bleeding vein of iron in the ground is supposed to behave. People who study these things will tell you there is a rational explanation for red water in a mountain stream, and in 100 other hollows they would be right. Iron oxide, a seep of mineral, a natural stain. But those 100 other hollows do not have a mill built to grind something no field ever grew, fed by a channel that runs up into the black under the ridge, running its reddest in the dead cold when nothing should be flowing at all. The Marricks did not build a farm in that hollow, they built a machine. And the account, when you follow it far enough, forces you to a question that the valley people spent 3 generations refusing to ask out loud. What was the mill of Blood Fork actually grinding, and where did the second channel bring it up from? To understand what the Marricks became, you have to understand what they refused to do, because the horror of Blood Fork is not a thing that happened in a single night. It is a thing that was done slowly, on purpose, across 3 generations by people who could have stopped at any time and chose not to. The refusal was simple. They would not marry out, and they would not let the line thin. In every account that survives, from the frightened memory of the valley people to the few pages of outside witness that exist, the same law runs under everything the Marricks did. The blood stays in the hollow. A daughter of Blood Fork did not go down to the valley to find a husband. A son did not bring a wife up the fork. Whatever coupling the family did, it did within itself, generation upon generation, folding the same blood over and over the way a smith folds iron, and the family called this the keeping, and they held it sacred. Now, mountain people were no strangers to close marriage. Isolation does that, and there is many a hollow in this country where the family tree grows more like a family thicket, cousins marrying cousins, because the next unrelated soul lived 2 hard days away over the ridges. But even the most isolated hollow married out when it could, brought in fresh blood whenever a stranger passed through, because the instinct to do so is written into people at a level below thought. You can see it in how quickly the other hollows braided together the moment a road connected them. The body knows what happens when a line closes on itself. The body has always known, and the Marricks knew it too. That is what makes the keeping so much worse than mere backwards isolation. They were not trapped into it. They chose it, and they chose it against the plain evidence of what it was doing to their own children, because to Elias Marrick and to the sons and daughters who came after him, the thing they were concentrating in the blood was worth more than the price the blood was paying. And the blood paid. The account describes it plainly, and the ground the crew opened confirmed it in the only way the ground can. The Marricks changed, not all at once, not evenly, but surely generation feeding into generation. The valley people who caught glimpses of them in the early years described a family that was strange but human, tall, pale, quiet, wrong in a way you could not name, but could not quite pin down either. The valley people 2 generations on described something they could barely make themselves talk about. Backs that had gone crooked in a shape that ran in the family, the same bend in the grandfather and the father and the child, so that they moved with a low sideways gait like something built to go on all fours that had been made to stand up. Hands with too many joints in the fingers, eyes set too wide and too pale, the cave water, shine that had been only a trick of the light in Elias Marrick, now sitting plainly in the faces of children born in the hollow, a family of eyes that gathered what little grey light came down through the high windows and gave it back flat and dim, and a silence. The later Marricks did not speak. Whether they could not or would not, no outsider ever learned, but the family that had once had a low even voice that carried too far became, by the 3rd generation, a household that made no human sound at all, that communicated in a way no witness could follow, and that watched the rare visitor with a patient wide-eyed attention that every single account describes with the same word: hungry. Here is the part that turns the stomach worst of all, and the part the valley people whispered rather than said. The keeping did not weaken the Marricks the way close blood weakens ordinary families. Ordinary close marriage brings sickness, frailty, children who do not thrive, a line that dwindles and dies. The Marricks did the opposite. Something in that hollow, something in the grey light and the red water and the stone that came from somewhere else meant that the more they folded the blood, the stronger the thing inside it grew. They were not dying out, they were concentrating. Every generation was less human than the one before it, and more of whatever Elias Marrick had carried down, out of the high country, and the family knew it, and the family wanted it, and up the black second channel under the mountain the mill turned, grinding, and the red water ran. It would be easier to bear all of this if the valley below had been innocent of it, if the Marricks had simply been a horror that happened to a helpless people who could do nothing but hide. But the account will not let the valley off that lightly, and the proof is in the ledger of the one crossroads store that did business with Bloodfork in the early years. Because the Marricks paid, and they paid in that heavy old silver, and the storekeeper who weighed it did not ask where an old man walking alone out of the high country had come by coin older than the country he was spending it in. He weighed it and he banked it, and he grew over those years quietly and considerably rich, and he was not the only one. There was a blacksmith who forged the strange long iron pieces the Marricks ordered to patterns they supplied and never explained, and asked no questions because the pay was good. There were the hired men who hauled the glass and the seed and the iron up the trace to the mouth of the fork and set it down and turned back, and who were paid better for that short frightened walk than for a week of honest labour anywhere else, and who took the money. The valley did not merely tolerate Bloodfork. For a while, before the fear grew too large to spend around, the valley profited from it. That is the quieter horror underneath the loud one, and it is the one that should keep an honest listener up at night. A monster in a hollow is a thing that happens to you. A monster in a hollow that half the valley is being paid to look away from is a thing you are part of. And when the toll changed, when the payments stopped being silver and started being peddlers, and started, in the lean winters, being children, the same habit of looking away was already worn smooth and ready, because the valley had been practicing it for profit, since the day the first old coin crossed the storekeeper's counter and he decided some questions were not worth the price of the answer. A closed family in a hidden hollow is a sad thing, but not by itself, a monstrous one. What makes Bloodfork monstrous, what earned it its place in the whispered history of these mountains, is what happened to the people who went up that fork and did not come back down. And people did go up it, because the world does not leave a hollow entirely alone, no matter how bad its name. There were peddlers in those days, tinkers and drummers who walked the mountain country with a pack or a cart, selling needles and cloth and patent tonics from hollow to hollow, and a peddler goes where the customers are and does not always heed a local superstition, especially when the local superstition might just be the valley people wanting to keep a rich strange family's trade to themselves. There were revenue men later, and timber cruisers, and now and then a hunter who followed a wounded deer past the mouth of the fork before he remembered where he was. The mountains have always swallowed the occasional traveller, but the fork did not swallow the occasional traveller. The fork kept a tally. The valley people learned to read the signs of it. A peddler would come through the crossroads settlement, a known man, a regular on the circuit, and he would ask after the folk up the far hollows, and someone would warn him off the left fork, and he would smile the way a travelled man smiles at a local fear, and go on up anyway with his pack of bright goods, sure the strange rich family would buy well. And that would be the last of him. Not that day, not always. Sometimes his cart would be found weeks later on the old trace, the mule still in the traces cropping grass, the goods untouched, the man simply gone as if he had stepped off the edge of the visible world between one step and the next. Sometimes nothing was found at all, and a name just quietly dropped off the circuit, and the other peddlers stopped coming that way, and the valley people noted it and said nothing, because to say it out loud was to admit they had known and let him go anyway. The account holds a handful of these lost travellers close enough to name the shape of what happened, and each one is a little worse than the last. There was a tin peddler who went up in high summer, and whose pack was found sitting neatly on the low stone doorstep of the Marrick house, every needle and thimble in its place, set down as carefully as an offering returned, and of the man himself never a trace but a single boot at the mouth of the fork standing upright in the red water, laces still tied. There was a preacher, a circuit rider, who heard there were unbaptized souls in a hidden hollow and rode up the fork on fire to save them, and who was seen 3 days later standing waist deep in the creek at the mouth of the fork, in the red water, not moving, not answering, his eyes gone to that same flat pale shine, and who, when 2 men finally worked up the nerve to wade out and bring him in, turned and looked at them with a stranger behind his face, and opened his mouth and made no preacher's sound at all. They left him in the water. He was not there the next morning. No one went to look. And there was, worst of all in the telling, the matter of the children who went missing from the valley itself in the lean years. Not Marrick children, valley children. In the hard winters, when a family had too many mouths and not enough meal, a child would now and then vanish from the lower hollows, and the grief of it would be borne the way mountain people bore their griefs, in silence and endurance, blamed on a bear or a fall, or the cold. But the mothers knew a thing they did not say to the men. They knew which way the missing ones had wandered. They knew that a child lost in the lean season was a child lost toward the north, toward the ridges, toward the one fork where the water ran red in the cold, and they knew that the Marricks, folding their blood tighter and tighter, and needing more than the hollow alone could give them, had learned to take what the valley would not miss too loudly. The valley people did not fight this. That is the thing to hold on to. They did not raise a party and go up the fork with torches and end it. For 3 generations they simply paid the toll, a peddler here, a lost child there, and kept their heads down and thanked God it was not their door, and let Bloodfork keep its tally in the dark. No family does a thing like the keeping for 3 generations without a reason that feels to them like the highest reason there is. Cruelty alone burns out. Hunger alone gets careless and gets caught. What held the Marricks to their long, slow work, what made grandfather and father and child all bow their heads through the same low doors and fold the same blood tighter and tighter, was faith. Bloodfork had a religion, and it was old, and it did not come from any book that the valley churches would have recognized. Elias Marrick brought it down out of the high country along with his silver and his stone, and he built a house for it in the hollow. And the account describes that house in a way that has kept more than one reader from sleeping. It stood apart from the dwelling, further up the fork, where the second channel came down out of the dark under the ridge, and it was the oldest and finest of all the Marrick stonework, which means it was older and finer than anything a family that arrived in the 1820s should have been able to build. The valley people, on the rare occasions any of them saw it, called it the meeting house for lack of a better word, but no meeting of the living was held in it. It had no windows at all. It had the one low door, lower than all the others, so low a grown person went into it on hands and knees, which is surely the point, because you did not enter the meeting house of Bloodfork standing up. You entered it crawling. And inside, by every account that claims to describe the inside, there was no altar, no cross, no image of any god that walks upright. There was a shaft, a round throat of that same fitted stone going straight down into the mountain, down past where any light reached, and the red water welled up out of it and ran down the second channel to the mill, and the Marricks gathered around the mouth of that shaft in the dark and did their worship down into it, to whatever lay at the bottom of the fork that gave the fork its name. The little that survives about the worship itself came out of the census man's shaking pages, and out of the trapper who ran, and the 2 accounts, made years apart by men who never met, agree in a way that is hard to explain away. Both describe the family gathering at the shaft not in the day but in the deep of the night, and not standing but down on the floor, arranged around the round black mouth of it in the low crawling posture the whole hollow was built to force on them, and both describe the sound. Not words, a low even droning that came up from the gathered family all at once, and went down into the shaft, rising and falling together without any signal that a watcher could see, the way a hive sounds, or the way wind sounds in a flue. A single voice, made of many that seemed aimed downward, poured down the throat of the stone as an offering in itself. And both men swear to the same final detail, the one that turns the blood, which is that the droning was answered. That after a long while of it, from very far down, from under the mountain, something would answer back in the same low tone, patient and enormous and pleased, and that the family would take the answer up and the sound would climb, and that no man who heard the 2 voices meet over that shaft in the dark ever afterward doubted for one instant that there was something down there listening, and that it knew the Marricks by name. The trapper said the worst part was not the answer itself, but the joy in it, a slow rising gladness in that buried voice, the sound a thing makes when the ones it has waited for a very long time have finally come home to the door. He did not sleep right for years, he said, and when he did, the low tone came up under his dreams like water under a floor. What did they believe was down there? The account is careful, and the account is frightened, and the account does not pretend to know for certain, but the shape of it can be traced. They believed something had come to that hollow long before people did, or had always been there, sleeping in the deep rock the way the old stories in every mountain country in the world speak of a thing sleeping under the hills. They believed the redness in the water was not iron, but the slow bleeding of that thing into the world, a thing that dreamed and whose dreams leaked upward as a stain. And they believed, this is the heart of it, that a family that gave itself to the thing wholly enough, that folded its blood down close enough to the thing's own nature, would not die the way ordinary people die. That the keeping was not corruption, that the keeping was ascent. Every generation less human meant every generation closer to the sleeper under the fork, and the Marricks did not see the crooked backs and the too pale eyes and the lost human voice as a curse. They saw them as progress. They were becoming what they worshipped, on purpose, down through the years, and they meant in the end to go down that shaft, not as offerings, but as kin. This is where the whole account of Bloodfork stops being a story about a wicked family and becomes something that reaches back and puts a cold hand on the settled history of these mountains itself. Because if Elias Marrick brought this faith down out of the high country, then it did not begin with him, and the stonework says the same thing the faith does. Walls laid without mortar by a fit so old and so sure that no frontier family could match it. Millstones of a stone that belongs to no nearby ground. A meeting house finer than the dwelling and older than the arrival. None of it fits the tidy account of log cabin pioneers taming an empty wilderness. All of it points the same direction, down and back, toward the idea that Bloodfork was not built new in the 1820s at all, that Elias Marrick did not come to raise a homestead, that he came home to a place that was already there, already cut, already waiting, and that the survey lines ran blank around that hollow. Not because a frightened surveyor could not finish them, but because there was already an older claim on that ground than any county in this country was ever going to enforce. By the time the country around it was changing, by the time the railroads had reached the edge of these mountains and the loggers had begun eating into the great forests, and the first tourists had come to marvel at the blue haze on the peaks, Bloodfork had gone almost entirely dark. The trade that had brought Elias Marrick's silver down to the valley stores in the early years had stopped. The Marricks needed nothing from below any more, or wanted nothing, and the hollow closed like a fist. Whole years would pass with no sign of them at all, no smoke that anyone would swear to, no track in the mud at the mouth of the fork, nothing but the red water running its reddest in the depth of winter and the cold coming off that hollow in a way the valley people said you could feel on your skin from the trace, a wrongness in the air like the held breath before something moves. The few glimpses that survive from those late years are the worst in the whole record, because they are glimpses of the keeping's final harvest. A trapper who lost his way in a whiteout and came without meaning to, up the wrong fork, and who lived to tell it only because he ran, told of shapes in the grey light between the stone buildings that he first took. For people bent under heavy loads and then understood were not bent under anything, that were simply shaped that way, low and long and moving with that sideways gait, and that turned toward him all at once when he made a sound, every pale face lifting together the way a field of animals lifts its heads, and came for him without a cry, in total silence, over the snow. He said it was the silence that nearly killed him. A man can run from a scream. There is nothing in you that knows how to run from a thing that hunts you without making any sound at all. And there is the account, told and retold in the valley until the edges wore smooth, of the woman from the lower hollows who went up the fork of her own free will, near the end, because her own child had been among the ones taken in a lean winter years before, and she had never stopped grieving and had at last gone half mad with it and climbed the trace in the snow to find him, or to join him. She came back. That is the thing that made the story unbearable. 3 days on she walked back down out of the fork on her own feet, and she was not harmed, not a mark on her, and she never spoke again, not one word for the rest of her long life, but her family said that some nights she would sit up in the dark and make a low even sound down in her chest, a sound with no words in it, aimed at nothing, aimed downward, the way you would call to something under the floor. They said she had seen her boy up there. They said he had not been a boy for a long time, and they said the worst of it, the thing that broke her voice, was that he had known her and had come to the low door and had looked at his own mother with those flat pale eyes, and had not wanted to come home. He had wanted her to stay. That is the last shape the Marricks took in living memory before the end. Not screaming monsters, something quieter and far worse. A family that had finished the long work Elias Marrick started, that had folded the blood down so close to whatever slept under the fork that they were more its kin than ours, that no longer spoke because there was no one left in them to speak, that hunted in silence over the snow and gathered around a shaft in the dark and called down into it in a voice with no words, waiting, the account says, for the last thing, waiting for the sleeper to answer, waiting to go down. And in the deep winter of the 1930s, in a season the old people afterward would only call the last cold, something in Bloodfork finally answered, and the 90 years of silence began. Almost everything we can say with any confidence about the inside of Bloodfork, about the low doors and the windowless meeting house and the shaft in the dark, comes down to us through one man, and he is the reason this story can be told at all instead of merely feared. In the middle of the 1920s, when the government was mapping and counting these mountains in earnest ahead of the great changes that were coming to them, a field man was sent up into that watershed to do the plain, unglamorous work of the census and the survey both, to walk the hollows and knock on the doors and write down who lived where. He was not a superstitious man. His notes make that clear. He is dry and careful and a little contemptuous of the valley people's warnings when he first records them, and he goes up the left fork the way the pedlars went up it. Certain the local dread is nothing but ignorance and the wish to keep a strange family's business private. What is left of what he wrote is the closest thing to a first-hand account of the Marricks that survives, and it is the source that the whole record leans on, and the reason it reads the way it reads is that you can watch a rational man's certainty come apart on the page, entry by entry, as the hollow works on him. The early entries are ordinary. He describes the trace, the mouth of the fork, the red colour in the water, which he notes with a surveyor's flatness, as probable iron. He describes coming upon the stonework and being a man who knows building, stopping cold, because the stonework does not fit his understanding of when and how this country was settled. And he says so plainly, in the careful language of a man who does not want to write down what he is seeing. He describes the low doors, and with a kind of stubborn pride, refusing to stoop through the first one and having to stoop through it anyway. And he describes the family. Here his handwriting, which is neat and even at the start, begins to do the thing the old surveyor's field book did almost a century before. It gets smaller, it presses harder. The lines run downhill on the page. He writes of the silence of them, of the pale wide eyes, of the way they gathered to look at him without ever coming close. Of a child, he thinks it was a child, that watched him from a high window that he had judged too high and too narrow for anything to reach, and that was somehow at the low door when he turned, and that made no sound, and that smiled at him in a way he does not describe, because, he writes, he does not have the words, and does not want to find them. His last full entries are given over to the meeting house and the shaft, and to the single night he spent in the hollow, which he did not intend to spend, and could not afterward fully account for. He believed he arrived in the early afternoon. When he next had a clear sense of the time, it was near dawn the following day, and he was standing at the mouth of the fork in the red water, with no memory of having walked there and one boot gone. And he does not say, gone where, and he does not say what filled the missing hours, and the reader is left with the surveyor's own dread pressing up through the careful hand. He got out. He is one of the very few outsiders in the whole account who went deep into Bloodfork and came back down able to write. And everything in the pages after suggests he spent the rest of a shortened life wishing he had not. He turned in a report that said the hollow was uninhabited. He knew it was not. He wrote it uninhabited anyway, the same lie the frightened surveyor of the 1840s had written in his own way, the same lie the valley people had lived for 3 generations. And with that one official falsehood, Bloodfork slipped a final time out of the ledger of the living. It was the last time an outsider walked in and walked out. What he had seen up there, whatever it was that gathered at the low door and smiled without a sound, had let him go for a reason, the way a thing lets one bird out of the trap so the flock learns to stay away. He told the mountains to leave Blood Fork alone, and the mountains for 90 years obeyed. What ended the Marricks is the one part of the story where even the account goes quiet, because there was no one left to witness it and no one willing to go up and see. But the shape of the end can be read the way you read a fire by its ashes. It came in the deep winter of the 1930s. In the season the last of the Old Valley people called the last cold, a winter so hard that the creeks froze solid down in the valley and the snow lay for weeks, and the world drew in on itself and endured. And in that dead white season the valley people said the wrongness that came off Blood Fork changed. For 3 generations it had been a steady thing, a held breath, a patient cold. In the last cold it broke. There were nights, they said, when a light showed up the fork that was not firelight, a low red glow that came not from any window but seemed to come up out of the ground itself, out of the shaft, casting the black shapes of the stone buildings against the snow. There were sounds. Not the silence the Marricks had kept for a generation, but a sound at last, low and even and enormous, felt in the chest more than heard in the ear, rolling down the frozen fork in the dark, a sound like the whole mountain clearing its throat to speak. The valley people barred their doors and banked their fires and did not look toward the north, and they prayed, and they waited, and after some nights of it the light did not come again, and the sound did not come again. And a stillness settled on Blood Fork that was different in kind from all the stillness before it. It was not the stillness of a thing waiting. It was the stillness of a thing finished. When the thaw finally came, no smoke rose from the fork. None rose the next winter either, or the one after. In time, a few of the boldest men in the valley, telling themselves it was about timber or about missing stock and not about the thing they all knew, went part way up the trace in daylight in a group and came to the mouth of the fork and went no further and reported only that the red water no longer ran red. It ran clear. Whatever had bled up out of the deep rock for 100 years and stained the creek and turned the mill and drawn the Marricks down into the dark had stopped. The vein was empty. And the family that had spent 3 generations making itself kin to the thing in the deep, that had folded its blood down closer and closer in the faith that the keeping was an ascent and that at the end they would go down the shaft, not as offerings but as family, was simply gone. No bodies were found because no one looked for bodies. No graves were dug because no one went in to dig them. The hollow held whatever it held, and the valley agreed, in the wordless way a frightened people agrees, that the thing to do with Blood Fork was to let the forest have it, and to let the trace grow over, and to let the bridge rot where it stood, and to let the name die on the tongue. There are 2 ways to read the end of the Marricks, and the account gives you both and refuses to choose between them, and that refusal is the most honest thing in it. The first way is mercy. The keeping had been running towards something for 100 years, and in the last cold it arrived, and the thing under the fork at last answered the family that had made itself worthy of it, and they went down the shaft into the deep rock the way they had always meant to, willingly, kin at last, and the red water stopped because the thing they had been feeding no longer needed to bleed upward to call them. In this reading, Blood Fork is not a tragedy at all. It is a homecoming. The Marricks got exactly what they spent 3 generations and countless stolen lives to earn, and the horror of it is that they wanted it and got it. The second way to read it is that something went wrong at the very end, that the sleeper woke, or half-woke, and took more than it was offered, that the great low sound rolling down the frozen fork was not an answer but an appetite, and that the Marricks did not descend in triumph but were pulled down screaming into their own God. Which reading is true depends entirely on a question no one could answer for 90 years, the question of what is actually down that shaft, and whether it is still down there, and whether it is still sleeping. And last winter a logging crew put a machine through the birch above the Little Pigeon, and the ground gave way, and the question stopped being one that the valley could go on refusing to ask. For 90 years the forest did its patient work of forgetting. The trace grew over, the birch and the laurel and the hemlock closed the hollow in a green wall, and the leaf fall built up year on year, and the washed clay came down off the slopes and buried the low doors, and the whole settlement of Blood Fork sank slowly under the ground, the way everything in these mountains sinks under the ground, if you leave it alone long enough. The people who had known the name grew old and died, and mostly did not pass it on, because you do not hand your children a fear you have spent your life burying. By the time the logging company bought the timber rights to that ridge, there was no one left who could have warned them, and the maps they worked from were the modern maps, and the modern maps had inherited the old lie. The interior of that hollow was blank on their paper the same way it had been blank on the surveyor's paper in the 1840s. And a blank on a timber map means only one thing to a logging crew. It means unclaimed trees. So they went up. They cut a new access line along the ridge and brought the machine up to push a landing flat above the head of the fork. And the operator, a young man who had never heard the name Blood Fork in his life, ran his blade into a stand of black birch and felt the ground drop out from under the treads. The account of what happened next comes from the crew themselves, and it is very recent, and it is told in the plain shaken language of working men who saw a thing their words were not built for. The machine settled hard, canted over, and when they got it stabilized and climbed down to see what had let go beneath it, they found the blade had sheared the top off a wall, cut stone, dressed and fitted and laid without mortar, 90 years and more in the black ground, and not a seam of it opened. They cleared more by hand, because a wall like that in country like that stops a working crew cold, and the more they cleared, the worse the wrongness got, because it was not one wall. It was a corner and then a doorway, low and square and cut with that impossible care, and beyond the doorway, when they put a light down through it, was a room that the mountain had swallowed but not filled, a stone room with the high, narrow windows choked with clay and a grey dimness in it that the light did not seem to want to reach into. They should have stopped. Every instinct that the valley people had spent 3 generations obeying told them to stop, but those instincts had died with the name. And these were curious men with a light and a hollow in the ground, and so they went in. They found the dwelling first, the long low house dug into the north bank, room giving onto room, all of it in that same seamless stone, all of it low, all of it built to make a person stoop. They found the deep hearths cold. They found, and this is where the crew's account starts to shake, arrangements of small bones set into niches in the walls, laid out with the same care the whole place was built with, not thrown down like refuse, but placed, ordered, kept, and among the small bones some that a man on the crew who had done a season as a hunting guide said quietly, were not animal, and after he said it, no one wanted to look too closely at the niches any more. They found the mill with its 2 large stones of the wrong dark rock, and its 2 channels, the natural race and the deeper lined one, running back up into the black under the ridge. And following the deeper channel up, following it the way the census man must have followed it and the surveyor before him, they came at last to the meeting house, oldest and finest of all of it, windowless, with the one door so low that a grown man went into it on his hands and knees, exactly as the account had always said, and inside the meeting house they found the shaft. It was open. That is the detail that has kept this from being just another abandoned ruin, another sad hollow the forest reclaimed. The shaft in the floor of the meeting house was open, a round throat of fitted stone going straight down into the mountain past, where any light the crew had would reach, and out of it came a cold that the men described in the same words the valley people had used 90 years before. A cold you felt on your skin from across the room, a held breath. And out of it, faint, so faint that at first each man thought it was only the blood in his own ears, came water. They could hear water, far down, moving, a slow welling, a patient run, coming up out of the deep rock where it had been silent and dry for 90 years. Whatever had emptied in the last cold of the 1930s, whatever vein had run dry when the Marricks went down into it or were pulled down into it, the crew standing at the mouth of that shaft with their lights and their curiosity and their 90 years of blessed ignorance were the first living people to hear that it had begun, very quietly, in the dark under the fork, to fill again. There was one more thing in the meeting house, and the crew who saw it have the hardest time of all describing it, because it is the single object from Blood Fork that does not sit quietly in the past where the rest of the ruin belongs. Set into the wall beside the shaft, at the height a person would reach, if that person were kneeling, there was a slab of the dark foreign stone dressed smooth and carved, and the carving was not decoration, it was a record. Row upon row of small marks, cut deep and even, running in ordered lines across the slab the way names run down a church register or a family Bible, and the men who studied it in the beam of a work light understood slowly and unwillingly that they were looking at a tally. A count. Marks made one at a time over a very long stretch of years by a hand that pressed each one in with care, and grouped here and there into clusters that a person could not help but read as generations. It was the ledger the Marricks kept, when the county's ledger had been made to hold a whole. Everything the paper below refused to write down, the family had written into stone, in the one place no surveyor would ever crawl, and near the bottom of the slab, in the last and freshest cluster of marks, the counting changed. The even careful strokes gave way to something cruder and deeper, gouged rather than cut, crowded and overlapping, and driven into the stone with a force that had chipped it, as if in the very end the tally had grown faster than the hand could keep pace with, as if whatever was being counted in those last marks had stopped being added one at a time and started arriving all at once. The crew did not photograph the slab. One of them tried, and said afterward that every picture came back the same, a dark smear where the carved stone should have been, though the phone worked fine on everything else in the hollow. He deleted them. He did not want them on his phone. He said the marks felt like they were still being added, down there in the dark, on a part of the slab that ran on past where the light stopped, and that he did not want to be holding a picture of a thing that was not finished. The others did not argue with him. By then they had all felt the same wrongness settle over the little stone room, the sense that the tally on the wall was not a record of something over and done, but a ledger still open, still waiting on entries, and that by standing in that room with their lights and their voices they had, without meaning to, presented themselves at the top of a fresh column. The crew did not stay. To their great credit, some older instinct that outlived the lost name took hold of them at the mouth of that filling shaft, and they climbed back up out of the hollow into the daylight and did not go down again. Work on that ridge stopped. The reasons given were the ordinary reasons that stop a job, unstable ground, an unexpected structure, a question of who really held the rights to trees growing over cut stone that no map admitted was there. But the men who were in the hollow tell it differently among themselves. They tell it the way the valley people once told it, in low voices, to people they trust, with the understanding that saying it too loud invites something. They say the sight is wrong. They say the cold off the shaft got worse the longer they were down there, not better as a body adjusts, worse, as if the hollow was slowly waking to the fact of them. They say that on the last day the young operator whose blade had opened the whole thing stood a long time at the low door of the meeting house looking down at the shaft and would not answer when they called him, and that when they took him by the arm and turned him around his eyes had a look in them that none of them had words for and that none of them has forgotten, and that he was quiet on the walk out in a way that was not like him, and that he has been quiet since. They do not say what they think happened to him in the moments he stood alone at that door, but they moved him off that crew, and they will not go back up the fork. And when you ask them why, the ones who will talk about it at all say the same thing, worn smooth already into the shape of the old warning. You do not take the left fork. And here the 90 years fold shut, and the whole account arrives, at last, in the present, in our own time, with the ground open and the water rising. Because the walls are still there. This is not a legend you have to take on faith, and a frightened surveyor's forewords in a ruined field book. The stonework is real, laid by a fit no frontier family could manage, of a kind that reaches back past the tidy story we were all told about how these mountains came to be settled. The mill is real, built to grind a thing no field ever grew, fed from the black under the ridge. The meeting house is real, windowless, its one door low enough to bring a grown person to his knees before whatever the Marricks knelt to. And the shaft is real, and it is open, and it is filling, and the red is coming back into the water of Bloodfork for the first time since the last cold of the 1930s. The people downstream have started to notice it. In the deep of this past winter, when the natural creeks ran clear and low, the left fork of the middle prong began very faintly at the coldest hour of the coldest nights to run rust. The county has been told, in the careful vague way such things get told, that there is an unrecorded historic site on that ridge, and that it will be looked into. Whether anyone with the authority to open Bloodfork all the way up has any idea what is written in the old pages, whether they have read the surveyor's forewords and the census man's shortened life, and the whole long quiet tally the valley kept, no one on the outside can say. Maybe they will send people up with proper equipment and lights that reach the bottom of the shaft, and maybe those people will find nothing at all but an old dry well and a family that died of the cold, and the close blood the way close blood kills. And maybe every word of the account is only the shape that mountain fear takes when it has 3 generations of stolen children to explain, and no way to bear the explaining. That is the reading that lets you sleep. Hold on to it if you can. But hold on to it, knowing that the same reading was available to the Valley people for 100 years, that they had every rational excuse laid out in front of them: iron in the water, bears in the winter, backwoods in breeding, wandering peddlers who simply moved on, and that they looked at all of it and chose, every one of them, generation after generation, to bar the door and bank the fire and never once take the left fork. They knew something. They knew it well enough to keep it out of the very ledgers that are supposed to hold everything. And what they knew is coming back up out of the ground. Sit for a moment with the one fact in this whole account that does not depend on a single frightened witness, the fact that is written not in ghost stories but in the paper record of the country itself. Blood Fork was erased, not lost, not overlooked, not too remote to reach. Erased. A settlement of worked stone finer than anything the pioneers were supposed to be able to build, standing in a hollow that the surveys ran their lines right up to and then left blank, that the census walked around, that the tax rolls never touched, that one official after another looked at with his own eyes and then wrote down as empty. That is not the way a poor mountain hollow slips through the cracks of a busy government. That is a decision, made and remade for 100 years by people whose job was to write the truth down, and who chose instead to write a hole. And once you have truly taken that in, a colder question opens under your feet, the same question the open shaft opened under the logging crew. If they could erase Blood Fork, if a whole stone settlement with a mill and a meeting house and a bloodline could be lifted clean out of the official memory of this country and kept out for the better part of a century, then what else is written as empty on the maps we trust? What else did the surveyors run their lines around? How much of the tidy story we were all handed about how this land was settled, log cabin by log cabin, honest and new and beginning from nothing, is the version that was allowed to stay in the ledger, and how much was quietly left blank because someone decided we were better off not knowing what was already here? That is the true shape of the fear at the bottom of Blood Fork, and it is bigger than one deranged family in one hidden hollow. The Marricks are terrible, but the Marricks are only the door. What is behind the door is the possibility that the record itself is a curated thing, that the wilderness these mountains are supposed to have been was never as empty as we were told, that older claims and older builders and older things sleeping under the hills were papered over with a clean new story, precisely because the clean new story is the one a person can live inside without going mad. The stonework says it. The stone that came from nowhere nearby says it. The doors built to bring you to your knees say it. Blood Fork is a place where the paper and the ground disagree, and for 90 years the paper won, because the only witnesses to the ground were too frightened to be believed and then too dead to speak. Now the ground has been opened by a machine that could not read the warning, and the paper is going to have a very hard time explaining the walls. Think about how much has to go right or wrong for an erasure like that to hold. One frightened surveyor could tear a page out of one field book. He could not silence a whole county for a century. What silenced the county was that every single person who came close enough to learn the truth of Blood Fork arrived at the same conclusion the valley people had, that the safest thing a human being can do with that hollow is pretend it is not there. The census man concluded it, the peddlers who lived concluded it, the mother who came back without her voice concluded it. Generation after generation, outsider after outsider, each one certain the last one had simply been superstitious, walked up to the edge of that thing, looked and walked away, agreeing to keep the map blank. That is not a cover-up in the way we usually mean the word. Nobody was paid, nobody was threatened. The hollow did its own concealing, by teaching everyone who saw it clearly that concealment was the only sane response, and the ledger followed the fear the way a shadow follows a body. Nobody knows yet how this ends. Maybe the site gets fenced and studied and reduced in the end to a strange but ordinary ruin, a curiosity for the historians, the red water written off one last time as iron. Maybe the shaft gets capped and the hollow gets a plaque, and the whole long dread of it dissolves in the daylight the way dread is supposed to, but the water is running red again in the cold. The shaft is filling in the dark. And somewhere in the county offices, if the account is right, there are old pages that a careful reader could lay side by side with the fresh survey of that ridge, and see plain as anything the exact shape of the lie, the blank interior, The lines that would not close, the 4 words a frightened man wrote before his book went white to the end. They asked me not to. The Marricks are down there still, one way or another, kin to the thing they fed or eaten by it, and the fork that holds them has been holding its breath for 90 years. And last winter, for the first time since the last cold, it let a little of that breath out into the water, where the rest of us could finally taste it. So what do you do with a thing like blood fork once you know it is there? That is the question the valley people answered with silence for 100 years. And it is worth asking whether their silence was cowardice or whether it was the last piece of hard mountain wisdom in the whole account. They did not go up the fork with torches and end it, and it is easy, sitting warm and far away, to call that a failure of nerve. But consider what they were actually facing. Not a man who could be shot, not a fire that could be put out, not a sickness that could be quarantined and waited out. They were facing a family that had spent 3 generations making itself into something that hunted in silence over the snow and could not be reasoned with, because there was no longer anyone inside it to reason with. And behind that family they were facing whatever the family knelt to, the thing under the fork that turned red water uphill in the dead of winter and rolled its voice down the frozen creek like the mountain clearing its throat. You do not raid that with torches. You do not win that. The most a small frightened people could do was what they did. Contain it, starve it of attention, let the forest bury the door and let the name die and pay the quiet toll and pray it was enough. For 90 years it was enough. And then a machine that had never heard the warning put its blade through the wall, and enough ended. There is a temptation, when a story reaches this point, to hand you a comfort. To tell you the site is being handled, the authorities are aware, the experts are on their way, sleep easy. This account does not have that comfort to give. And it would be a lie to pretend otherwise, because the plain truth is that the only people who ever really understood Bloodfork are the ones who kept it off the maps. And they are gone, and they took their understanding into the ground with the name. The people who will open that hollow now will open it the way the census man opened it and the surveyor before him, as rational men certain the local dread is nothing, and the account is very clear about what the hollow does to rational men who are certain. It lets a few of them out. It lets them out changed and quiet, with a look in their eyes their friends will not forget, so that the warning survives even when the record does not, passed hand to hand in low voices, worn down over the years into 5 plain words that outlived every ledger and every map and every family that ever tried to write the truth of that place down. You do not take the left fork. You will not be going up the middle prong of the Little Pigeon any time soon, and Bloodfork is not your hollow to bar the door against. But the reason this story matters, the reason it is worth carrying out of these mountains and into your own night, is that Bloodfork is not really about one cursed creek in one range of hills. It is about the seam. It is about the place where the story we are told and the ground we stand on come apart, and about what waits in that gap when someone finally digs down into it. Every settled country has its blank squares. Every tidy history has its hollows the surveyors ran their lines around and left white. Most of them, surely, are nothing, empty land, honest gaps, the ordinary silence of a record that cannot hold everything. But some of them are blank on purpose. Some of them were left off the ledger by people who looked at what was really there and decided, generation after generation, that the map was safer with a hole in it than with the truth, and the only thing keeping those places sleeping is that no one has yet put a blade through the wall. Last winter someone did. The wall is open, the shaft is filling. The water is running red again in the cold, a little more each hard night, coming down out of the black under the ridge where a family that made itself into something else went down 90 years ago, and where, if the account is right, the thing they went down to has begun, very slowly in the dark, to stir. The Marrick clan of Bloodfork was the mountain's most deranged dynasty, and it has finally been unearthed, and the terrible lesson of it is not that such a family could exist. It is that they were right about the one thing that mattered most. They believed something old and patient was sleeping under that fork, waiting to be fed and folded and kin, and they gave it everything, their children, their voices, their human shape. 3 whole generations poured willingly down a hole in the ground. For 90 years you could tell yourself they were only mad. But the walls are real. The stone came from nowhere. The water is red again. And somewhere far down that open shaft under 90 years of silence, something that the valley spent everything to keep buried is awake now and listening, and it knows the door is open. Whatever you do with the rest of tonight, do not go looking for the left fork. Some things the mountains bury, they bury for us, and some of them are learning, right now, in the dark, how to climb back out.